Good afternoon and welcome to CCK Live. My name is Jenna Zellmer and joining me today are Elise Golaski and Nick Briggs. We all work on Veterans Benefits Appeals here at CCK, and today we're going to be talking about anxiety. Now, before we get into it, I just wanted to remind you all that if you have any questions or comments during our conversation, you can go ahead and leave them in the comment box below. And we'll also be posting links to blogs and more information on our website at cck-blog.com. So let's get into it. So, Nick, why don't you start us off? We're going to be talking about both service connection and increased rating for anxiety today. And let's start with talking about service connection. So, Nick, what are some common anxiety disorders that veterans can claim service connection for?
Sure. So one of the more common types that we see are generalized anxiety disorders, but there are also other specific types of anxiety disorders like social anxiety, panic disorders, and then specific phobias like agoraphobia.
Okay. And Elise, what are some common symptoms that characterize these anxiety disorders?
Sure. So there's some of those like invisible symptoms like excessive worry or difficulty concentrating, but then there's also symptoms that physically manifest. So you can feel jumpy, or you might be dizzy, have difficulty sleeping, have muscle tension, feel nauseous, or even lightheaded.
So these are all manifestations of an underlying anxiety condition. And I think that it's really important. I think a lot of times veterans think that they can only get service connected for PTSD, because I think that, often PTSD goes in hand with a lot of experiences that veterans experience in service. But even though anxiety disorders are a little bit different, if you go to your doctor and they don't diagnose you with PTSD, but they do diagnose you with any of these symptoms or any of the anxiety disorders that Nick mentioned, you can still claim service connection for that specific condition. So what do veterans need in order to show service connection for this condition?
So the first and most important thing that you want to be able to demonstrate is in-service incurrence. And that can take a number of different forms. Either the veteran specifically treats for and is diagnosed with an anxiety disorder in service. They might just check that they were experiencing depression or excessive worry on their discharge examination. Or there might have been some specific incident that they remember that caused their anxiety, and it's continued to persist since then.
Okay. You don't need to be diagnosed with anxiety.
For sure.
Okay. You just have to have some sort of notation. Yeah. Elise, what else? What after an in-service occurrence, what else do you need to show service connection?
The next thing you're going to need is a nexus. So that's what's going to connect both your in-service condition to what's going on with you now. Typically, that's going to require some type of medical opinion because laypersons are not competent typically to make that connection. So it's a medical opinion usually that's going to draw that nexus.
Great. And we have a Facebook Live all about what you need to show all three elements of service connection. So we'll link that in our notes. And if you want more information just on general service connection, you can check us out there. So Elise, you had mentioned that you need a nexus, and that generally requires an examination or a medical determination. So how do C&P exams, which is what we also call them, which stands for compensation and pension exam, how do those work in relation to anxiety conditions? What would happen in a service connection for anxiety claim?
Sure. So typically with a C&P exam, you're going to be meeting with a VA physician who it's going to be somebody that you've never met before, most likely. They will ask you about your experiences during service. They'll also ask you about experiences that you have now. They may also ask you about any medical history, any family medical history. It's going to be a lot of questions that are all going to be what they're going to use to support an opinion on as to whether what you have now is related to service or not. So it's going to be a lot of those background questions, family medical questions, and they'll also ask you about what your current symptoms are.
Mm-hmm. And I think we also have a Facebook Live all about C&P examinations, which has a lot of great information kind of explaining what's going to happen in these exams and what you should and shouldn't do. I think the biggest thing is you should always show up for your examinations. Mm-hmm. And then if you get an unfavorable opinion, Nick, what are some remedies that the veteran can pursue?
Sure. Well, oftentimes a veteran won't necessarily know that the opinion was negative until they get the next decision from VA denying their claim. So first and foremost, they need to make sure that they're requesting a copy of their VA examination, which they're entitled to do. And then once they have the exam, they should go through it at length, making sure to identify any specific problems that they noticed or things that they think conflict with other evidence they've submitted before. One of the things that VA examiners are supposed to do is review the claims file and make sure that they're looking at everything the veteran submitted, including lay evidence, and then considering all of those things in light of the examination itself.
Great. I think the one important thing that I heard you say in that is lay evidence. So we've talked about medical evidence and why we need that usually for a nexus, but can you talk a little bit about what other kind of evidence, including lay evidence, you might need to support a claim for anxiety?
Sure. Lay evidence is often one of the things we go to most often, if only because a lot of the time veterans don't feel comfortable seeking treatment for their condition during service or even afterward, because it's something that is kind of stigmatized and people don't necessarily like to talk about it. So it could be many years before they actually get to the point where they feel they need to seek treatment. And lay evidence from the veteran, him or herself, and all of their family members can help fill in some of those gaps. But whenever possible, it's also a good idea to submit treatment information from either your VA doctors or any private psychologists that you see.
Great. So let's kind of take a step back and talk about the Appeals Modernization Act. So we have a whole Facebook Live on the AMA, as we call it. Essentially, back in February, VA totally revamped their appeal system. And so now there are several different avenues that a veteran can pursue after they receive a unfavorable rating decision. So if a veteran, wants to file an appeal, what should they kind of know about the AMA after they receive a rating decision from VA?
Sure. So the most important thing is that if their claim was previously denied and they're filing a supplemental claim, which is one of the new options under the Appeals Modernization system, they need to make sure that they're submitting new and relevant evidence. That's meant to be a relatively relaxed evidentiary standard. So it could be something as simple as providing a lay statement talking about how their symptoms are related to service. It could be submitting medical evidence establishing that they have a current diagnosis. But whatever it is, it needs to be something that is relevant to their claim. And then they can also pursue taking their case to the board with or without submitting additional evidence if they really do think that it's a situation where the regional office is just getting it wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But all of those options are still available to them. They just need to be conscious of the 1-year timeframes.
Great. Yeah, I think the AMA is a pretty new system and it's pretty complicated, although it is supposed to provide veterans with more choices and it's supposed to clarify a lot of things. I think it's still unclear kind of how it's going to work for veterans. So we would really encourage you, if you're seeking to initiate an appeal under the AMA, to consult your veteran service organization, an attorney, someone who has some expertise in this area of law. And as I mentioned, we'll link some more information to the AMA in the case notes or in the comments below. So we're talking about service connection, and we mentioned in-service occurrence, a nexus, and a current disability. What if a veteran doesn't have an in-service occurrence? Can the veteran get service connection another way, Elise?
Yes, so an alternative way to get service connection is called secondary service connection. This happens when you have an already service-connected disability that is either causing or aggravating your anxiety or a second condition. So say that you have, just for example, you have a knee condition, and your knee condition causes you a lot of pain, and it makes you anxious to get out of bed, it makes you anxious to walk down the street or to walk to work. You could potentially show that you have secondary service connection for your anxiety because your knee condition is already service connected, whether it's either causing or aggravating an already existing anxiety condition.
Great. I think that anxiety is something that a lot of veterans probably have secondary to their service-connected disabilities, especially physical disabilities. I think in your example, for example, if the veteran had a lot of instability in their knee and they were never sure whether or not they were going to fall, I can imagine that causing a lot of anxiety. And so just the same way that you would need a nexus opinion for direct service connection, you would still want to get a doctor to make an opinion about whether or not that knee causes or aggravates anxiety. So it's really good. So let's assume that a veteran has received service connection. They've met that first threshold, either secondary or direct. Let's talk about how VA rates anxiety. So let's take a step back a little bit and talk about kind of how VA rates things in general. And I think that we do have some information on that in our past Facebook Lives. Elise, do you want to talk a little bit about what diagnostic codes are and what the diagnostic code for anxiety is?
Sure. So if you think about the diagnostic code, the best way to think of it is it's this rubric where the VA has established certain disabilities, and under those disabilities are certain rubrics. If you meet certain criteria under the rubric, then you're granted you should be granted a certain rating. Specifically, anxiety is rated under the general formula for medical or mental rather disorders. So that's going to also include other mental disorders, which could be schizophrenia. It could also be PTSD, the very many different types of anxiety there are, and probably any other type of mental condition that you can think of are all rated under the same diagnostic code. That's going to be diagnostic code 4.130. That diagnostic code goes up to 100%. It starts at a non-compensable rating of 0%. And it lists specific symptoms and overall functional impairment that you would have to meet to get the specific rating.
Good. So, Nick, Elise mentioned that kind of several different psychiatric conditions are all rated under this one general formula. So, what happens if a veteran has, for example, both anxiety and PTSD, or anxiety and depression? Does that affect your rating at all?
Sure. So like Elise mentioned, even though individual psychiatric conditions do have their own diagnostic codes, they're all rated under this general formula. And because of that, and because they're all rated based off of the same criteria, factoring in the same symptoms, you're not going to receive separate ratings for each individual mental health condition. They're going to figure out which symptoms are imposed by each of those conditions and then give you one overall rating using the general formula.
Good. And I think it's important to kind of keep that in mind when you're looking at your rating code sheet. Every rating decision comes with a code sheet that lists out all of your disabilities. And over the course of your life and your different appeals, your rating for your psych condition can change, and the characterization of your psych condition can change based on what VA determines kind of what the diagnoses you have. So, for example, veterans who were first service connected a long time ago for psychiatric conditions might be originally rated under something called like a nervous condition. And then as medical information has kind of evolved, that could get recharacterized as PTSD or anxiety. And then sometimes, a veteran could be service connected for one thing and then later on claim service connection for another psychiatric condition. As Nick said, you're not going to get a separate rating for that second condition, but they might recharacterize what it's called on your code sheet. And so that's important to keep in mind, and just to make sure that if there are symptoms that weren't originally compensated under your original characterization but you feel are now encompassed in that characterization, you might want to make a claim for an increased rating. So Elise, you mentioned the different possible rating levels, and you mentioned that the diagnostic code and the rating formula provides different symptoms and different criteria that you need to meet in order to get to a higher rating. So do veterans have to meet every single criteria in that rating in order to get to the higher rating?
No. So technically you don't even have to meet a single one of the criteria. What you have to do is show that your functional loss is similar in what's called severity, frequency, and duration to the type of symptoms and functional loss listed in this diagnostic code. So if you receive a board decision that says the veteran's not entitled to a higher rating because although he has certain symptoms in the 70 criteria, he does not have them all, that would be error. You don't have to meet all of their criteria. What you have to do is show that your functional loss is overall similar in severity, duration, and frequency to these types of symptoms that they're listing. It's a list, it's a non-exhaustive list, and it's really just supposed to be examples.
Great. And there are two cases that kind of go to that point, Vasquez Claudio and Mauerhans.
Yes.
So for those of you who kind of want to dig a little deeper into the case law, the court has made clear that these symptoms are not required. So, Nick, what happens if a veteran's condition is so severe that they actually have to get hospitalized?
Sure. So periods of hospitalization are considered to be totally disabling. So in situations where a veteran's hospitalized due to their mental health disability for more than 21 days, they're entitled to a 100% rating for the period of the hospitalization. But if the veteran is hospitalized for an extended stay of more than 6 months, they're not only assigned the 100% rating for the entire length of the hospitalization, but as well as 6 additional months after the date of their discharge.
That's great. I think that makes sense if you think about how VA rates disabilities and that the ratings are supposed to be based on impairment in earning capacity. So obviously if a veteran is hospitalized, they can't be working. And so, it's really important if you do get hospitalized, you want to make sure that you tell VA and make sure that VA is appropriately compensating you. So that's really important to keep in mind. And then, I think that a lot of times when the veterans are going to seek treatment or they're seeking a VA examination, they get something called GAF Scores, GAF. So, Elise, do you want to talk a little bit about GAF Scores and whether or not they're even still relevant or what's going on with GAF Scores?
Sure. So a GAF score is a somewhat or outdated way that practitioners used to measure how severe a person's psychiatric disorder was. It is from a previous version of the DSM. VA has since come out with a court decision called Golden, which says that those GAF scores are no longer in the DSM-5, and therefore they're outdated and they shouldn't be used by the board. So in some circumstances, you might still see them mentioned in your board decisions, but the board really shouldn't be relying on them to deny you a higher rating.
Mm-hmm. And if you see the board talk about GAF scores in relation to what rating you should be receiving, that should be a red flag. Mm-hmm. And you can talk to, an attorney or a VSO about potentially appealing that decision to the board. Or to the court, excuse me. And Elise mentioned the DSM. So the DSM stands for Diagnostic Statistical Manual. It's the manual that all mental health professionals use in diagnosing mental health conditions. So we have a question from Steven. Can you explain the difference between occupational and social impairment with reduced reliability and productivity and occupational and social impairment with deficiencies in most areas? So these are the criteria for the 50 and the 70% ratings, and this is actually an excellent question. So Elise, do you want to take a stab?
I'm smiling, Stephen, because it is a very good question, and it's one that the board has not yet answered for us.
The court.
Or the court, rather. So they haven't provided exact definitions of what those things mean. But if you look to the diagnostic code, you can try and get a sense of what types of symptoms fall under each of those. But unfortunately, we don't have a straight answer for you because the court and the board VA have not defined it further than what we already see in the code. You can look at some of the symptoms, for example, in the 50%, what is contemplated by occupational and social impairment with reduced reliability and productivity include flattened affect, panic attacks more than once a week, impaired judgment, impaired abstract thinking, difficulty in establishing and maintaining social relationships. In the step higher, you're seeing it involve more areas of your life other than just the occupation and some of your relationships. You're also seeing suicidal ideation, obsessive rituals, near continuous panic rather than panic attacks once a week. You're seeing an inability to establish and maintain effective relationships. Now, like we were saying before, you do not need to show all of these symptoms. It's just meant to be a list of examples to give you an idea of what that level of functional loss is.
Precisely because the different ratings are so vague.
Right.
Like, what is the difference between reduced reliability and deficiencies in most areas? And so you use the symptoms in order to kind of parse that out. But as Elise said, the court hasn't really given us a lot of guidance on this, and that results in a lot of wildly inconsistent board decisions.
And that's sorry, Nick.
No, go ahead.
That's what makes the board's requirement to provide adequate reasons and basis so important, because they don't have a strict definition of what these things mean. They're really supposed to be properly explaining to you as the veteran why you're not entitled to a higher rating with what we call adequate reasons and bases.
Yeah, and it's especially important in the context of anxiety disorders because oftentimes it's the type of mental health illness that might only really manifest itself in 2 or 3 specific symptoms, where it's the overwhelming anxiety and frequent panic attacks that are causing you to be unable to function in these areas. But because VA tends to rely on the number of symptoms that you have rather than how severe they are, it can get complicated, especially when they're not really defining the concepts that they're using.
Right.
Sure.
That goes back to what Elise was saying about it's really focusing on the frequency, severity, and duration of these symptoms. And so if you see VA kind of using this rating criteria as a checklist, that should, raise a red flag that it's probably not a very good decision, and that you could potentially appeal it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Nick, especially because we are talking about anxiety, which is not a condition that typically actually manifests itself into a lot of the symptoms that you see in the highest 100% rating, like hallucinations. But if you, for example, have such severe agoraphobia that you can't leave your house or can't leave your room, then you might have total occupational and social impairment. So even though agoraphobia isn't a symptom listed under the 100%, the overall functional loss might be enough to get you there.
So that's a really great question, and I think it really highlights why this area of law is so unclear and why it's important to, consult with your VSO or consult with an attorney, because they can kind of navigate this and figure out what the best solution or argument to make in your case is. Great. So we talked about GAF scores and the DSM. So I think the next thing that we want to talk about is what happens if a mental health condition overlaps with a non-psychiatric condition. Nick, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a concept we talk about a lot called pyramiding, and I think we have our own Facebook Live sessions on that topic. So please refer to that if you have any more detailed questions. But the basic idea is that VA is only going to compensate each symptom that a veteran experiences once. So if the veteran experiences or suffers from an orthopedic disability that causes sleep impairment and then a psychiatric disability that causes sleep impairment, they're going to generally rate that symptom under one of those diagnostic codes, one of those conditions, and then not rate it under the other one, just to make sure that they're not overcompensating the veteran for the symptom.
And then I think the kind of reverse of that is what Elise was mentioning earlier, is if your psychiatric condition results in non-psychiatric symptoms, then you could potentially get, it's like the opposite of pyramiding. It's when pyramiding isn't a problem, is when there are distinct manifestations of your condition, and you can get separate ratings for that. That makes sense. So we talked a little bit about this in terms of total occupational and social impairment, but what happens if a veteran's anxiety prevents them from working?
Sure. So there is an avenue to receive a 100% rating called TDIU. This is what you may be entitled for if your disabilities could be your anxiety alone, or your anxiety combined with all of your other service-connected disabilities prevent you from securing what's called substantially gainful employment. So this is actually a lower standard than total occupational impairment. Substantially gainful employment is another one of those terms that we're working on getting a really good definition for. But basically it is something that is more than just a marginal employment, something that is more than what we call protected work environment. And if somebody's anxiety combined with their other disabilities prevent them from really obtaining secure employment, then they might be entitled to TDIU. We absolutely have a lot of information on our website about TDIU. That is a very large area of veterans law. So if you have any questions about that, absolutely advise you to look at our website, as well as our other, I'm sure there's a Facebook Live on that as well.
Definitely. So what other kinds of evidence should veterans be kind of collecting and submitting in order to support their increased rating claims, Nick?
We've mentioned it a few times in the context of service connection, but it applies equally well to increased ratings, and that's lay evidence. Obviously, the veteran will only see their treating provider or a VA doctor every so often. There are going to be months or even years where they don't seek treatment, but the people who know them, who live with them, who experience their symptoms on a day-to-day basis are often in the best position to provide a description of, what those symptoms are and how they affect them. So getting statements from yourself, getting statements from family members can go a long way.
Mm-hmm. And I think, one of the most common mistakes I see in that situation is that the board or VA provides or assigns more value to those treatment records as opposed to the lay statements. And as Nick said, I think it's really important to kind of highlight that they are both equally valuable and that they are probably complementary in most situations. So even though a veteran, might go to treatment and might not be super severe on that one day he goes to treatment, if he has all these lay statements filling in the gaps between treatment, you can kind of get a bigger picture. So that's kind of one of the more common mistakes that I see VA making. To just kind of wrap things up, do you guys have any other thoughts on common mistakes that VA makes in adjudicating anxiety claims, or things that you think veterans should remember when they're making these claims?
One thing, actually, it's along the lines of lay statements. If you are submitting lay statements, and this is kind of a new one, make sure that what you're submitting is legible, because you want to make it easy for VA to agree with you. So if they can't really read your handwriting, then it's very difficult for them to understand what symptoms or what your story is. So I just suggest, whether you're typing it or in very neat handwriting, lay statements should be legible, easy to understand, make it easy for them to want to give you an increased rating.
I think that's really good advice.
Sure.
It's better for us too.
Yeah. Another common example we see in the case of service connection is VA improperly requiring a verified stressor, which is something that's only really in place for post-traumatic stress disorder.
That's a good one. Yeah.
So most veterans are probably most familiar with PTSD, so that tends to be the condition that they claim. But VA is supposed to construe that claim broadly and liberally. So the veteran might end up being diagnosed with a different mental health disability, but because they claimed PTSD initially, VA will often get stuck on trying to adjudicate the claim that way. But at the end of the day, like we talked about before, it's really just all about establishing anxiety in service or reports of anxiety and then symptoms afterward.
I think that's a really good note to end on. Great. Well, thank you for joining us today. We will be back next week, and we hope that you check out all the information we provided.